The Union Club's mahogany-paneled dining room overlooked Central Park through floor-to-ceiling windows that had witnessed a century of Manhattan's most powerful men conducting the business that shaped America. November 15, 1984. Al Pacino sat at the corner table, wearing his finest navy suit, completely out of place among the Ivy League uniforms and inherited confidence that filled the room like expensive cologne. At 44, he'd conquered Hollywood, but in this bastion of old money privilege, he was still just the plasterer's grandson from the South Bronx who'd somehow bought his way into their sacred space. But tonight, these titans of inherited wealth were about to learn that some battles can't be won with bloodlines. The invitation had come from Martin Whitmore III, a film investor whose family fortune dated back to railroad money from the 1800s. Whitmore had expressed interest in financing Al's next project, suggesting dinner at his private club to discuss the opportunity in civilized surroundings. Al had agreed, understanding that serious money often came with social requirements that had nothing to do with artistic merit. The Union Club was old money incarnate. Leather chairs worn smooth by generations of privileged backsides, oil paintings of long-dead robber barons, and the particular silence that came from centuries of people who'd never had to raise their voices to get what they wanted. Every member was born to this world, educated at the same schools, married within the same circles, and measured success by how little they had to prove their worth to anyone. Al observed the ritual unfolding around him with fascination. Conversations conducted in modulated tones about summer houses in the Hamptons and winter skiing in Gestad. Casual mentions of board positions and charity galas that cost more than most people's yearly salaries. These weren't just wealthy men. These were American aristocrats, convinced that their accidents of birth made them inherently superior to anyone who'd actually earned their position. Martin Whitmore III held court at the center table, his silver hair perfectly styled, his Savile Row suit impeccable, his voice carrying the particular authority that came from never doubting your right to command attention. At 62, he represented everything Al had spent his career fighting against: unearned privilege, inherited arrogance, and the belief that breeding mattered more than achievement. Quite an atmosphere, Al said to his dinner companion, Charles Pemberton IV, whose family had made their fortune in steel before the Civil War and had been living off the interest ever since. Indeed, Pemberton replied with the kind of smile that suggested he was tolerating rather than enjoying Al's presence. The Union Club has maintained its standards for over 150 years. We're rather proud of our exclusivity. The word exclusivity carried weight, a reminder that Al was here as a guest, not a member, and that his presence represented a temporary exception to rules that normally kept people like him firmly outside. I can see why, Al replied diplomatically, though something in his tone suggested he was cataloging everything he observed for future reference. The dinner proceeded with the ritualized politeness that defined these gatherings. 7 courses served by staff who moved with the invisible efficiency of people trained to anticipate needs before they were expressed. Wine selected from cellars that held bottles worth more than luxury cars. Conversation that touched on politics, business, and culture with the casual authority of people who believed their opinions shaped the world. But Al could sense something building beneath the surface courtesy. Glances exchanged when they thought he wasn't looking. Subtle smiles that didn't reach their eyes. The particular energy that preceded a coordinated attack disguised as social entertainment. It began innocently enough. Whitmore, perhaps emboldened by the wine and his audience, started discussing the unfortunate direction of modern cinema. It's become so common, Whitmore said, his voice carrying the disappointed tone of someone observing the decline of civilization. All that psychological drama and working-class angst. Whatever happened to entertainment that elevated audiences rather than wallowing in their problems? Several heads nodded in agreement around the table. Al continued eating his perfectly prepared duck, saying nothing, but his dark eyes were now focused with the intensity that had made him famous. Take this Scarface business, continued Pemberton, warming to the theme. Absolutely vulgar. All that screaming and violence, celebrating the worst elements of society. Hardly the kind of culture we want to promote, is it? The attack was surgical, targeting not just Al's most controversial film but suggesting that his artistic choices were fundamentally harmful to society. Still, Al remained silent, perhaps recognizing that these men were building towards something larger. But that's what sells to the masses these days, added Harrison Caldwell V., whose ancestors had signed the Declaration of Independence and who'd never worked a day in his 70-year life. Appeal to the lowest common denominator. Give them violence and emotion instead of refinement and class. The conversation was clearly orchestrated, each man contributing to a coordinated dismissal of everything Al represented. But they were just getting warmed up. The problem, Whitmore said, setting down his wine glass with deliberate precision, is that we've allowed people from certain backgrounds to influence American culture without understanding what makes civilization actually civilized. The pause before certain backgrounds was loaded with meaning. Every man at the table understood exactly what Whitmore meant, and Al understood that the gloves were about to come off completely. It's really quite fascinating, Pemberton added with false intellectual curiosity, how someone can achieve commercial success without any real understanding of cultural refinement. Like a clever mimic who's learned to approximate sophistication without actually possessing it. The insult was devastating in its elegant cruelty. They had just called Al a successful fake, someone who'd learned to imitate quality without understanding what quality actually meant. Al set down his fork with controlled precision, his movements so deliberate that conversations at nearby tables began to quiet. The dining room's ambient noise dropped several decibels as other members sensed that something significant was developing at Whitmore's table. "Gentlemen," Al said quietly, his voice carrying a new quality that made everyone within earshot suddenly more alert, "are you trying to tell me something specific?" Whitmore smiled with the confidence of a predator who'd successfully cornered his prey. "Simply that there's a difference, my dear Al, between success and substance. Between achievement and breeding. Between earning money and deserving respect." The final insult was perfectly calibrated. Whitmore had just informed Al that despite his fame, his wealth, and his artistic accomplishments, he would never truly belong in their world because he lacked the one thing that mattered most to them. The right bloodline. "You see," Caldwell added with mock sympathy, "we come from families that built this country, that created its institutions, that established the standards of excellence that define American civilization. We understand culture because we've been responsible for it for generations." The attack was reaching its crescendo, each man contributing to what they clearly believed would be the complete humiliation of the working-class actor who dared to enter their sacred space. "Whereas you," Pemberton said with the crushing finality of a judge delivering sentence, "are simply someone who learned to pretend very convincingly. Which is admirable, certainly, but hardly the same thing as authentic quality." The silence that followed was profound and dangerous. Al sat perfectly still, his hands resting calmly on the white tablecloth, his breathing controlled, but something in his eyes had changed. Those who knew him well would have recognized the expression from his most intense performances, the moment when a character decided that enough was enough. When Al finally stood from his chair, his movement was so controlled yet commanding that every conversation in the dining room stopped completely. The mahogany-paneled room, which had hosted titans of industry and presidents, had never witnessed what was about to unfold. "Gentlemen," Al said, his voice quiet but carrying to every corner of the silent dining room, "let me tell you about authentic quality." But what happened next would do more than just answer their insults, it would shatter their entire understanding of what made a man worthy of respect. But what happened next would do more than just answer their insults, it would shatter their entire understanding of what made a man worthy of respect. Al remained standing beside his chair, his presence suddenly commanding the attention of every person in the Union Club's dining room. The silence was complete, even the waitstaff had frozen in place, sensing that something unprecedented was about to unfold in their sanctuary of inherited privilege. "Authentic quality," Al repeated, his voice taking on the controlled intensity that had made him one of the most compelling actors of his generation. "That's an interesting phrase coming from men whose greatest accomplishment is being born to the right parents." The attack was immediate and surgical, delivered with such quiet conviction that several members at nearby tables leaned forward to listen. Whitmore's confident smile flickered slightly, perhaps not expecting such direct confrontation in a room where disagreement was usually couched in diplomatic language. "Let me tell you about my grandfather," Al continued, his voice gaining strength. "Salvatore Pacino. He came to America in 1903 with $8 in his pocket and hands that knew nothing but hard work. He spent 40 years laying plaster on walls, building the very buildings that house your family fortunes." Al began moving around the table, not threatening but commanding, his energy filling the space around them like an electrical charge. Every morning, Salvatore got up at 4:30 and worked until dark, covered in dust and chemicals that burned his lungs, so that his children might have opportunities he never dreamed of. His hands were cracked and scarred from decades of honest labor, hands that built something real instead of simply inheriting something already built. The dining room was electric with tension now. This wasn't the polite acceptance of social hierarchy these men expected. This was a working-class kid from the Bronx defending his bloodline against their aristocratic arrogance. "And you want to know what authentic quality is?" Al asked, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper but somehow carrying to every corner of the silent room. "Authentic quality is a man who risks everything he has to create something that never existed before. Who spends months disappearing into the psychology of characters that most people don't have the courage to explore." Al looked directly at Whitmore, his dark eyes carrying the kind of focused intensity that had defined his greatest performances. "When I prepared to play Michael Corleone, I didn't just learn lines and put on costumes. I spent 2 years understanding how good men become monsters through the choices they make. I explored what it costs psychologically to destroy your soul to protect your family." The attack was devastating because it was true. Al was describing the kind of commitment and risk that none of these men had ever attempted in their comfortable, consequence-free lives. "That's not pretending, Martin," Al continued, using Whitmore's first name with deliberate familiarity. "That's having the courage to risk your sanity, your relationships, your personal stability to find truth in places that comfortable people never explore." Al moved closer to the table, his presence somehow making these powerful men seem smaller by comparison. "And when I played Frank Serpico, I didn't research the role in libraries and interviews. I rode with undercover narcotics officers in the worst neighborhoods in New York, watching them risk their lives every day for principles that men like you mock as working-class angst." The room was completely still now, every member understanding that they were witnessing something that would be talked about for decades. "I watched honest cops get threatened, transferred, and worse for refusing to take money from drug dealers. I learned what it costs to maintain integrity in a system where corruption is easier than honesty. That's not wallowing in problems, that's exploring the moral complexity that you've never had to face." Al's voice was building now, not getting louder but gaining depth and resonance, filling the mahogany-paneled room with the kind of presence that explained why he was considered one of the most compelling performers of his generation. "You want to talk about what built American civilization?" Al asked, his voice taking on a new edge. "American civilization was built by immigrants like my grandfather, working 16-hour days in factories and construction sites and sweatshops, dreaming that their children might have better lives." Al looked around the dining room, taking in faces that were now watching him with expressions ranging from shock to something approaching awe. "It was built by people who earned every dollar through sweat and sacrifice, not by people who inherited fortunes built on the labor of others and spent generations congratulating themselves for being born lucky." The devastation was complete, but Al wasn't finished. He had one more point to make, one that would ensure this moment was never forgotten by anyone present. "But you want to know what really separates us?" Al asked, his voice returning to the quiet intensity that made people lean forward to listen. "When I die, people will study Michael Corleone and Frank Serpico and Tony Montana to understand what it meant to be human in the 20th century." Al paused, letting his words settle over the silent dining room like a judgment. "They'll analyze those performances in universities, they'll write dissertations about the psychological truth I brought to those characters, they'll use my work to explore fundamental questions about power and morality and the American dream." Al looked directly at each man at the table, his gaze carrying the weight of absolute conviction. But when you die, gentlemen, the only thing anyone will remember is that you inherited money from ancestors who actually accomplished something. Your entire lives will be footnotes in other people's biographies, the idle rich who lived off the achievements of previous generations. The silence that followed was profound and transformative. These men, who had spent their lives believing that birth was destiny and breeding was everything, were confronting the possibility that they had never actually created anything of lasting value. You mock my certain background, Al continued, his voice taking on a tone that was somehow both respectful and devastating, but my background created characters that will be studied and remembered long after your family names are forgotten. My pretending has contributed more to American culture than your authentic breeding ever will. Al straightened his tie with deliberate care, his movement controlled and dignified. So when you talk about substance versus success, remember this. I created my success through 30 years of risking everything for artistic truth. You inherited your positions through the accident of being born to families who stopped creating anything meaningful generations ago. Al picked up his napkin and placed it carefully beside his plate, a gesture that somehow felt more final than any dramatic exit could have been. Thank you for dinner, Martin, Al said politely, his voice returning to the respectful tone he'd used at the beginning of the evening. It's been educational. With that, Al walked out of the Union Club dining room, leaving behind a table full of men who had just experienced something they'd never encountered before, being held accountable for the emptiness of their inherited privilege by someone who had earned every moment of respect he commanded. The silence in the dining room lasted nearly 5 minutes before anyone found the courage to speak. When conversation finally resumed, it was subdued and thoughtful, as if everyone present was processing what they had just witnessed. Word of the confrontation spread through Manhattan's elite social circles within hours. By the next morning, every major society columnist was reporting on the Union Club incident. The night Al Pacino had publicly challenged the foundation of old money aristocracy and won. Martin Whitmore III never again made dismissive comments about certain backgrounds, and privately told friends that his encounter with Al Pacino had forced him to examine what he had actually contributed to society beyond managing inherited wealth. The other men at the table found their subsequent social gatherings somehow less satisfying, as if Al's words had poisoned the well of their comfortable assumptions about superiority and worth. Years later, when cultural historians studied the decline of WASP influence in American society, Al's confrontation at the Union Club would be cited as a symbolic moment, the night when earned achievement definitively triumphed over inherited privilege in the court of public opinion. The Union Club itself quietly revised its membership policies in the following years, beginning to accept members based on personal accomplishment rather than solely on family pedigree, a change that longtime members privately attributed to the uncomfortable truths Al Pacino had forced them to confront. And Al never forgot the lesson he had learned that night. That sometimes the most important battles aren't fought on movie sets or in reviews, but in the places where entrenched power tries to dismiss the value of those who've earned their position through talent, dedication, and the courage to risk everything for something they believe in. The plasterer's grandson from the South Bronx had walked into the heart of American aristocracy and reminded them that in a country built on the principle that all men are created equal, the only authentic quality that matters is what you create with your life, not who created you.